inventor of photo-optical instruments, an ordnance physicist and engineer, scientific project manager, science policy advisor and planner, administrative assistant at NASA. I mentioned Ray Bisplinghoff earlier. Edson worked for him. A Cold War theoretician of human progress. Regrettably, we won't have time to talk much about that. A public lecturer and an idea wizard with a real penchant for coming up with creative and dynamic solutions to scientific and engineering problems. He's born there in Kansas City, over on the far east, and his family migrates down to Hartshorn, Oklahoma to the south, and then back up to that general region around Oakland Park, Topeka, Lawrence, in search of employment. His father is constantly being reemployed and unemployed, and this unfortunate situation means that they are traveling fairly often. His father is James O. Edson, his mother's Irene, and he's the oldest of three children. James himself, Patricia, Patsy, and Alden. Early in life, he is sent to a military school, and the time period pretty well explains why. World War I is in full course, and although he won't reach maturity until after World War I has ended, he is sent to a military school, probably as part of the preparatory process for eventually going to war if it should come to that, which eventually it does, but a different war. Unfortunately, during this same period, the Spanish flu pandemic strikes and takes the life of his father, leaving his mother and the three children in fairly dire financial straits and forced to make do as best they can. Edson is almost immediately required to find work to help support the family, and this becomes a kind of norm for him. At around the same time, when he's around 12 to 14, he begins to think about what he might like to do, and he homes in on medicine and astronautics as two potential areas he might like to work in. Not sure which one to do, and he describes a story in which he's wandering through the aisles of the public library and eventually realizes that by hook or crook, American science and engineering are going to bring humanity outside the Earth, and he wants to be part of that process. The account of this is quite late and may have some embellishment. On the other hand, he almost immediately engages in astronomy and the study of astronautics once he enters undergrad education. So it's actually possible that he's telling the truth and was aware of this already. He also works as a photographer in Kansas City. I mentioned that he had to seek employment to help support the family. The photography he does actually involves bringing for the first time color photography to the city of Kansas City. And so you can see already that between military school and new photographic technologies, he's already finding himself somewhere between optics and military life, combined with an interest in space and astronautics. He also works as a radio technician. So his aptitude for technology combined with his interest in it and space start to converge. He graduates from Westport, I believe, high school in 1928, spends 2 years at Kansas City Junior College, and then goes on to the University of Kansas in 1933, in January of that year, where he almost immediately encounters a name I'm pretty sure almost everyone here will know, Clyde Tombaugh. You can see him there at just about that time. I should mention that the photo is from 1931, so a year after Tombaugh has discovered Pluto. And in other words, Tombaugh discovered Pluto before he entered college. If I wasn't impressed, I am now. He meets Tombaugh in the spring of 1933, and Tombaugh, as a visitor to Edson's home, also meets Edson's sister, Patsy. They fall in love fairly quickly, and within a year, they're married. So now, Clyde Tombaugh and James Edson are brothers-in-law. While at the University of Kansas, he attends the ROTC as part of the ROTC as part of the Jayhawk Battalion. And he there helps to form with Tombaugh and some other students, about half a dozen or so, the Syzygy Club, an informal group devoted to astronautics, astronomy, space, science fiction, and interesting things. And already, because Tombaugh, as you can see from the picture and the date, is affiliated with Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, there is a kind of byline for Edson to become acquainted in more than one way with American astronomy. He also there as a worker at a student cafeteria meets Lily Summers of Tonganoxie, Kansas. I think she's born in Bowling, but by the time he's met her, she's lived in Tonganoxie for quite a long time. And the two of them fall in love. And within just a few years, the two of them are married. They do move fast. Well, after his graduation, he graduates Sigma Chi in 1935 with an AB in physics and astronomy. He has a connection in the form of Clyde Tombaugh, his professors, in fact, with Lowell Observatory. Now, Lowell is a kind of prototypical model of early 20th century science in the fact that it is initially founded by a wealthy philanthropic initiative, a man named Percival Lowell, who, in addition to being a member of the Boston Lowell family, a very wealthy East Coast family, is himself an investment banker and does a pretty good job of it. So he has the money to burn to subsidize the founding of an observatory like this. And that model of wealth bankrolling the study of nature for its own sake is really fairly typical of early 20th century science. We can, of course, think of the Smithsonian and some large institutions as also carrying out science and being among the few that are actually government subsidized. But that's the exception rather than the rule. And most science is actually being done by fairly small institutions, small staffing, along with, of course, universities. So Edson enters Lowell Observatory as a darkroom assistant and begins processing photographs of planetary astronomical images, some of which are quite striking. The director at the time, informally as of about 1916 and formally a little later, is this man, Vesto Slifer, who wins my award for the coolest name ever. Slifer has started already to make his name. He is studying the spectroscopic properties of planets and galaxies, from which he discovers that the galaxies don't actually seem to be contained within the Milky Way, something that wasn't known yet at the time. It was believed that maybe this one very large structure contained all of what we now know are very distant galaxies. And as he studies these spectroscopic properties, he also realizes that they are emitting a common signal, not a signal, a common signature of light spectra. We now call this redshift. And although Slifer didn't know it, he actually had stumbled upon the first convincing piece of evidence to suggest that the universe was expanding, because the redshift he observed was identical for distances in all directions. So if you look at something in distance A from one direction and then from another direction, you will see that at distance A, the two bodies, whatever they are, have relatively to each other the same redshift. And this suggests that, in fact, the universe is expanding. Vesto Slifer did not know this at the time, but in hindsight, he's really one of the first to start moving Hubble's discovery toward an expansionist model of the cosmos. Here's a nice picture of the staff circa 1932. So while Edson is still in high school, or at least in between high school and college, you can see Clyde Tombaugh there in the middle, next to Carl Lamplin, looking cheerful as always. And Henry Geeklas, who actually spends the rest of his life at Lowell and dies at 96, having spent his entire life at Flagstaff and almost his entire life working with Lowell. Very impressive. And there you can see a gathering of some of the staff and their families. Right in the middle is Edson with his characteristic widow's peak, and to his right, Patsy Tombaugh. And further on right in the polka dots is Lily Edson, his wife. He works mainly with Carl Lamplin and especially Earl Slifer, the younger brother of Vesto. Earl Slifer is one of the preeminent planetary astronomers of the time and an expert in particular on the planet Mars, which had been a mainstay of Lowell's study since its founding. But Venus is coming up high on his list, and especially so when Edson is on the scene. The two of them produced the first color images of Mars and galaxies ever made. You can see a nice, somewhat blurry picture here of Earl Slifer from a Disneyland special in 1957 called Mars and Beyond. If you haven't seen it, I really encourage you to watch it. It's a real treat. But Slifer is giving a showcase of his planetary skills. That's not right. There we go. Meanwhile, as he's a darkroom assistant at Lowell, he and Lily do actually marry in 1936 at a small church in Santa Fe. A year and some change later, Priscilla Cindy Edson is born, and education becomes a kind of core bastion of the family. Not only is Edson a master's student and well on his way to becoming a scientist, but Lily is a high school teacher in rural schools, some elementary school teaching as well. And Cindy is already showing a precocious talent for mathematics. She is now a retired professor of mathematics from the University of British Columbia in Canada, so clearly a heritable talent. Enjoy seeing them because that's the last time you will for this talk. In the summer of 1937, so shortly after the baby is born, I'd love to know who actually took care of it, Edson is invited by Robert Goddard, who did not give invitations easily, to Mescalero Ranch near Roswell. This shop had been set up for the specific purpose of experimenting and testing rocket development, on which Goddard was quite far along. He is knee-deep in the L-series tests at this time, which spans a couple of years. It's not clear exactly when Edson visits him, but depending on when he visits him, he would have seen either roughly the middle of the L-series testing, or, and this is quite interesting, the addition of movable tails to help steer rockets as they faced upward wind velocity as they traveled. And that change actually is a transformative one, in that it provides a way for rockets to steer, which allows the scaling up of the size of a rocket without the loss of the rocket's ability to get as high as it possibly can. Prior to this, his rocket series, he just lovingly names them Nell, achieves quite a feat, 8,000 to 900 to be exact. Excuse me, 9,000 to be exact. So almost 2 miles in altitude. And having done this, he's now trying to see if he can get it even further. And the addition of the movable tails is a way of thrust vectoring to provide that ability. Once again, you can see a model of American science that's quite different from something that we would recognize today. A private shop with Goddard and one assistant out in the middle of nowhere, no offense, Roswellians, and funded, incidentally, by institutions like the Smithsonian. Goddard's monograph, very famous astronautic monograph published in 1919, is funded by the Smithsonian. And his work here is being funded by other institutions. So there isn't, I mean, there's some funding coming from Clark University, but there really isn't a great deal of infrastructure apart from philanthropic and private organizations for funding this kind of science. In Goddard's case, it probably also doesn't help that he is somewhat marginal and in a few quarters considered a bit of a quack for having ideas about rocketry that are at odds with then current physics. You can see him here 8 days before he launched his first successful rocket. There's the very first model of Nell there to his left. He's in Massachusetts, so this is before he set up shop in New Mexico, but his successes pretty easily and quickly convince him that the next step needs to be a much broader rocket test in which he needs far more space than an urban center like Massachusetts can provide. And of course, the later V2 includes just these vanes for thrust vectoring. So you can see already that Goddard is thinking far ahead of his time for rocket design and thinking far ahead of his time of what a rocket the size of the V2, although he hasn't reached it yet, his rockets are about 16 to 18 feet long, would need in order to achieve a very high altitude. Edson completes his master's thesis in 1938, some studies in planetary photography. And his claim to fame in the master's thesis is to devise a new camera which would allow him to adapt the needs of Lowell Observatory to times when the large refracting telescope, the large reflecting telescope, which is at the center of the Clerk Dome, isn't available. It's required in an observatory of the size of Lowell to do astronomical observation under what are called homogeneous conditions. You keep them the same. So if you need to observe anything else, it becomes very hard to do because you only have this one giant telescope. Slipher and Edson devised this highly adaptable telescope, camera, for testing theoretical ideas in astronomy and adapting them to specific experimental needs that are not really suitable for the Large Reflecting Telescope. So already we can see, going into Edson's thinking, the need to modify existing optical instruments to produce different effects and to be adaptable under conditions that will vary considerably. He does publish a kind of abstract or digest of the basic findings. And you can see here on the right the first photographs of Venus showing the twilight arc extension, as it's called, which is the ring of light that's formed as Venus enters an inferior conjunction. You can't really see it very well, but on the left photo, there's a slight blob with an arrow pointing right to it. To us, that seems fairly trivial and not very significant. To a trained astronomical eye, this is a gold mine because it offers a window into studying the spectroscopic properties and atmospheric properties of the planet Venus, and by extension, to begin doing that to other planets as the optical capacity of telescopes increases. So really a significant jump. And eventually his data and information about this, including the core of the thesis, is published in a paper called The Twilight Zone of Venus, which is a chapter published in 1963. You can see again that faint blob, the almost imperceptible blob in the final photo at the bottom, number 20, on November 22nd. And that blob gives an enormous window into making sense of Venus's atmosphere. After his master's thesis is complete, Edson then applies to, is accepted in Caltech. And in between, he takes the opportunity to do something very interesting. He forms with a group of Caltech students prior to his formal matriculation, the Planet Group. And the Planet Group is a group of people who are, as the name implies, interested in planets, but especially interested in trying to give a name to planetary astronomy, which in their collective estimation had a lower status and privilege than other forms of astronomy that were really moving to the cutting edge. Of course, with the advent of satellites, it's going to change dramatically, but at this point, there is a kind of glass ceiling for planetary astronomy. During this time, he's also working for the Fred C. Hinson company, which is a maker of scientific instruments. It's now defunct. And Edson is working as a designer and microtechnician. So once again, he's now applying his skills toward adapting existing technologies to improve them. And because he's constantly at the cutting edge, because of working at a company like this, he's almost perfectly poised to do something that very few people get to do, which is to then work on the cutting edge of science that's coming. You can extrapolate and do the math from the years that something big is coming. And here you can see Edson's sketch of the observing site. I mention it only because the site was already the site for the Smithsonian's Astrophysical Observatory. Once again, your options are few if you want to do science at this time. You're either doing it under direct funding from a university, within one of the very few institutions that funds through government auspices, or a private philanthropic initiative. And this is really a model for thinking about how most of science is being done. But as we know, that's about to change significantly. The Planet Group captures another sunset of Venus to confirm some of the findings Edson had made earlier. And they get a nice shiny publication out of it. You see, here we are, Jim. And at about this time, he meets a man named John D. Strong, one of the most important optical physicists of the 20th century, and a physical meteorologist. He's trained as an astronomer, but he has become aware, as others have, and they make this known to the Young Turks at Caltech, that the future of planetary astronomy lies in part on the ability to extrapolate physical conditions on the Earth, in other words, geophysical and meteorological conditions we are familiar with, to other planets. The optical technology to do this in earnest is just at its beginning, and there are certainly no satellites yet. But there is a transformation in the way in American science toward a unification of an astrophysical perspective of studying other bodies, or a planetary astronomical perspective, and a geophysical perspective or a meteorological one. And the two are going to converge very soon into something like what we think of as planetary science. So Edson, under Strong's influence, decides that in fact he's right, and decides this with enough conviction that he switches tracks from astrophysics to meteorology. He's completed quite a few of his courses, but by the time he switches, he's realized that this is, for his vision, the future of what he would like to do for planetary astronomy. He then begins working for Kellogg Radiation Laboratory. Why? Well, Pearl Harbor is bombed, and World War II now includes the US. The US's entry into a total war beckons virtually every scientific institution in the country to begin contracting with the government. And that contracting with the government, as we know in hindsight, begins to act as a kind of lubricant and a quicksand for American science, in that, on the one hand, you can't resist the pull of it, quite literally, because you're part of an institution that's doing nothing but science funding for war efforts. So that's one. And on the other hand, the advancement of science for the future will depend on what's being done now. And in the meantime, you are a graduate student or an undergrad. So what do? You become part of the process too. That transformation is in some ways the germ for what flowers within another decade or so as big science. The Kellogg Radiation Laboratory is one of the main centers for this. There is another radiation laboratory, at least by name, at MIT. But MIT's radiation laboratory is not. The name is actually a lie. It's put out for the sole purpose of masking its actual intentions, which is in part the development of radar. And while Edson is at Kellogg Radiation Laboratory, his work focuses primarily on the specialty of Caltech. Of course, Caltech is where the Jet Propulsion Laboratory is. So he is neck deep in the production of anti-submarine and anti-aircraft missiles. I would say that this is the beginning of the next phase of his work, but it's also the beginning of the next phase of American science, for the same reasons that it is for his own. That in order to continue doing what he does, he has to, in a sense, co-opt basic research into the applied work of a total war. And that's going to begin shading over into basic research for the next several decades, and I think actually is fairly predominant even now. The Kellogg Radiation Laboratory's contracts are overseen by this man, Charles C. Lauritsen, Danish-American physicist, and a quite prominent one. And the principal investigator, or PI, of the project is Ernest C. Watson, seen here doing one of his favorite science experiments for students. Together, the two of them oversee the two major contracts on which Edson works, the numbers of which I gave you earlier, OEMSR 250 and OEMSR 418. The second kind of gobbles up the first one and becomes a vast multidisciplinary effort in the designing of rocketry and missiles. Well, Kellogg is, in point of fact, a radiation laboratory, unlike MIT's, and can be quite dangerous. So as wartime development begins and the research is beginning to be carried over into applied science, there are some risks involved. This is a newspaper clipping regarding an explosion that happened in early 1942, which killed one of the research associates and injured 6 others. Edson was at this time a research associate, so luckily he wasn't present when this happened. The newspaper story in the Los Angeles Times actually goes on to describe this as a gunpowder vault. I think if a few clever Germans had seen this story and had put together what they knew was going on with what was probably going on, and this really bad cover story, they probably would have been able to figure out roughly what had been going on there. And it was dangerous for Edson too. Although he survives the explosion, he is exposed to radiation. Yeah, this is an image from late in his life, 7 years before his death. His right hand eventually develops cancers from his exposure to radiation, and he has to undergo surgery. He survives it, but this isn't very long before his death. And most of the exposure is probably from the Kellogg Radiation Laboratory. Spoiler, he is actually involved later on with the transition of US nuclear weapons from strategic to tactical. And I have not seen any evidence to suggest that he was exposed to radiation during that time, but that's also a possible factor. One of his main projects is the designing and implementation of this fascinating ribbon camera for tracking rockets. It's sometimes just called the Bowen Knapp or Knapp camera. I'm not sure if Knapp was of German descent by one or two removes. It might change the pronunciation. But Ira Bowen and he worked together on this as a premier project under one of the contracts. And you can see right there in the top left of the second image, the trajectory of the rocket. And that trajectory is being captured by an extremely narrow aperture that's being recorded very, very quickly over a ribbon. That recording is in effect the same basic optical principle that's later going to be employed when Edson devises the ballistic tracking telescope. It's the same basic concept with a slightly different implementation. Edson has been, up to this point, a lieutenant in the Army Reserve. Again, he was in ROTC and eventually ended up in the Army Reserve. But living now on the coast, he is basically placed in a category for anti-aircraft, as many on the coast were, in the fact that the Japanese might invade, and if they did, the US needed to be prepared with anti-aircraft technology. And as a lieutenant, there is a conflict because men with his level of technological background and sophistication are extremely few for exactly the reasons I've been talking about so far. There just are vanishingly few people who have had these kinds of opportunities, and the infrastructure, we think of it now in degree programs and funding and assistantships, just isn't there yet. So he's requested as a physicist and engineer for Aberdeen Proving Ground, and he's allowed to be discharged. He does move to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where he focuses on anti-aircraft targeting systems. The system he develops actually becomes so successful that it ends up training the US Navy. He himself trains about 22,000 people in it, and it becomes the standard form for the Navy for quite a long time, at least a decade. He is working at the Ballistic Research Laboratories in the Rocket Division. And this is a new division tasked specifically with the total war preparation of missiles and rockets. But as you can start to imagine, and maybe do some math from the time that NASA is founded, you can see the seeds of a basic research perspective being applied to a total war reality. Edson eventually becomes the chief of the special projects, the special problems section. And later on in the late 40s, well after the war, moves to the photographic measurements branch. But while he's chief of special problems section, something has been happening in the later phases of World War II. It's hard to think of a more special problem in ballistics than a man named Wernher von Braun. And in April and May of 1940, I forget, Jim, maybe you can help, 44 or 45? 45, yeah. Wernher von Braun and his staff, at least some of them, surrender to the Americans because the Americans are, in effect, the only ones who can afford them. They detest the French, they're frightened of the Soviets, and they don't think the British can actually afford to do what they want to do. So they surrender to the Americans, a very tactical decision. And now Edson, as chief of the special problem section at Aberdeen, is tasked with what to do with the new information that's going to be coming from Wernher von Braun and his staff. I'm not certain, by the way, that Edson was actually present for this rocket test, but given the time period, I have a suspicion that he was actually involved in it. It's something I've been looking into lately. You can see him there on the right with the rest of the rocket division in Maryland. This is late in the war. And there we go. And at Aberdeen, because of his work with special problems and his connection to special problems, one of his tasks is to devise new weapons. So by this time, the Allies had invented something called the Tiny Tim. It's a quite large missile with a quite large payload. And one of its distinguishing features is that it's incredibly destructive because, in addition to its payload, it has two motors. So Edson, very late in the war, we've seen just a few months since Wernher von Braun and his staff are captured and taken to Antwerp and are en route eventually to the United States for the development of a new rocket. It's never been given an actual name because it was never put into official production. It doesn't have a name like Tiny Tim, but I would call it its immediate successor because it takes the Tiny Tim and amplifies it with the same basic strategy. It adds an additional motor, so it's got 3 motors, and is meant as a cave buster or a bunker buster because with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's very clear that strategically invasion is going to be a possibility. And in order to invade, the Philippines are the great blockade facing the Allies in any attempted invasion of Japan. And if you've seen anything in the news of the last couple of years about Hamas and tunneling, you can get an analog for roughly the kinds of problems that they face because many of these Philippine-based soldiers, Japanese soldiers, are positioned in caves and underground bunkers and honeycombed throughout the islands. In order to get rid of these, you need something with incredible force with an extremely high payload. And Edson, within 10 days, devises and tests the T-103 trimotor rocket bomb. You can see him here on the far right giving a debriefing of the demonstration on August 10th, 1945. I believe he's actually holding the document there on the right, which is a plan of events. So I think he's actually going through the plan of events with the present soldiers and staff in order to explain to them what's about to happen. Incidentally, August 10th is the day after Nagasaki is bombed. In addition, it is the day on which the first company of soldiers arrives in White Sands, and the day on which Robert Goddard dies. So a kind of trifecta of very important events, all converging toward roughly the same goal. And there you can see the trimotor bombardment rocket. It was only tested once and never actually put into use. It was planned, but the surrender of the Japanese and the ending of World War II effectively destroyed it. And you can see there on the right, the modified mount, which is made from a bulldozer. The ending of the war and the Japanese surrender causes an immediate and a fairly frantic demobilization of this group. And Edson hightails it back to the United States with a new project. Again, he's chief of the special problems section. And what could be more special than the arrival of Wernher von Braun and his team? Initially, Operation Paperclip, which I'm sure some of you know a few things about since it involves this area so much. It's initially called Operation Overcast. It's a common figure to mention the 16 to 1800 German scientists, engineers, and technicians that are involved in this massive evacuation effort. Less mentioned is their families, because in addition to the actual scientists, engineers, and technicians, almost all of them had families. So in total, the number is actually something closer to 5,500 people that need to be evacuated and brought to something like a stable existence to continue working on rockets in the US. Meanwhile, the components for the A4 rocket, we better know it as the V2, are being transported through the north in a project carried out by the UK called Operation Backfire. And the pieces are being put together and tested there, but most of them are actually ending up in the US under Army control. In addition to capturing the scientists and making use of them, we need to make use of the information that they have. During the capture of von Braun and his team, something on the order of 14 tons of documents are captured and brought to the United States. And these documents are by and large in disarray, and giving some order to the archives is a crucial component of Operation Paperclip. Edson is involved in both. He helps von Braun and his team reassemble the archives because he has the technical know-how and expertise to know what it is he's looking at. And he also is the person, one of the people tasked with debriefing them on the current state of American rocket technology and what's coming next. So what's the end game for doing all of this? Well, of course, it's to learn about how the V2 works, but it's also to adapt it to existing American technologies and in tandem with them to develop the next stage of American rocketry. And it's no coincidence then that von Braun's team have already thought of and had a strong interest in astronautic travel. So going beyond where the V2 has ever gone before and actually taking it into space. So already you can see the beginnings of a complete transformation in the very way of thinking about science. Because in order to do this at all, you need a level of funding, a level of infrastructure, a level of physical space, a level of connectedness that had never been achieved before and was really only achieved, in a sense, at the seat of their pants and with a great deal of luck. So there's a nice photo of the immediate capture and surrender of some of von Braun's team and himself. He's in a cast because he was in a car accident just a few months before and very stubbornly wouldn't stay in the hospital. So they had to break his arm and realign it. And there's a nice photograph of the A4, later the V2, being tested at Peenemünde, which is the major hub for German rocket testing before and during World War II. This particular photo I include because a print of it was given by one of von Braun's men to Edson as a gift for helping them assemble their archives. A bit of moral ambiguity there in the fact that they are ex-Nazis, and I put the X in scare quotes, but also quite important because there are two letters that survive between Edson and von Braun's team, which have been donated to the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville, Alabama. Unfortunately, I've spoken with the archivist, and no one there has any idea where they are. They don't database as well as perhaps they ought to, and my best understanding is that they are still looking for them as we speak. So hopefully those turn up and we get a better window into what Edson was doing with them. And there you can see the so-called paper clippers, some of von Braun's central team members at White Sands in January of 1946. In a sense, this is one track, right? The Operation Paperclip and the projects stemming from it are one major track of capturing a piece of technology not perfected or really even achieved by Americans, getting into its guts, making sense of it, adapting it, learning from it, and learning how to develop the next stage of it. And of course, Edson's involved. White Sands is formally founded in July of 1945. There had been a proving ground and gunnery range in Alamogordo before that, but White Sands, as designated, is in July of 1945. And it's initially founded as an annex of Aberdeen's BRL, the Ballistics Research Laboratory, for which Edson is working. So in addition to Operation Paperclip, there's now a transition to a project that's partly concurrent with it, but is ultimately its successor, Project Hermes. And this is that adapt and advance component. Now that we have the V2s, we need to put them to every conceivable use we can think of, and from that process, develop the next stage of rocketry globally. This includes the bumper program, which is a sharp refinement of the original V2 in tandem with existing American technology toward what's called the WAC Corporal, without aerial control corporal, which is one of the transitional and landmark rockets in this difficult phase, let's call it, in the move toward a more big scientific model for American rocketry. At this point, early in this process, the Office of the Chief of Ordnance also invites the US Navy to participate. And that is, in a sense, a linchpin for the second track, which is that now that we have this V2 and we can actually get into the guts of that technology and refine the doing of rocketry as rocketry full stop, there's a question about what we're going to do with it. I mean, of course, astronautics is on the table as something of interest, but there's more. You see Edson charmingly trudging through the desert. One of the answers is that we need to understand how this thing actually works from a perspective other than the engineering of the rocket itself. And the existing technology to do that just didn't exist. Parts and components of it did, but nothing in the order of systematically studying the components of the rocket as they were in flight. So this is the chapter of Edson's life for which he's best known. I won't belabor it too much because it's the one that's the most published and talked about. But just very briefly, he does develop the first ballistic tracking telescope at Aberdeen, the so-called T1, which begets a whole T-series of ballistic tracking telescopes, and ships it to White Sands for use in tracking the movement of the V2 as it's being sent out and tested. And as Edson says, all of the optical parts for the first tracking telescope were begged, borrowed, or stolen. The best of all are the Japanese Navy high-power binoculars, which are acquired as basically a barter ship in the Philippines between Edson and a Japanese soldier in exchange for some scotch. So your scientific dollars at work. Here's an image of the team, the tracking crew team in the initial development of Little Bright Eyes. You see Edson there on the left. I also want to draw attention to the guy in the big hat there, Ralph Konigan, who is Edson's assistant, and I think is a bit understated in some of the literature as a person who really does play a seminal role in actually developing the technology for this thing. But as you can see, it's on an M45 mobile carriage mount. It's basically a set of metallic parts with a couple of telescopes and binoculars and a 35 millimeter film reel roll. It's a kind of Frankenstein's monster, but the core idea connects all of the parts into one whole, which is that we can now watch, film, and understand what the rocket is actually doing as it's going beyond what we could ordinarily see and detect. And we can see it much closer because of this technology. And there's a nice trifecta of images for you, just to give you a sense of what this thing actually looks like. It is the conceptual ancestor for all of the other T-series that followed. I don't have T2, but here is T3, and then T4. Again, if you haven't already seen or heard Bill Godby's talk February of 2024 at the Doñana County Historical Society meeting, I would encourage you to watch it on YouTube because that gives you a better sense of the T-series development and his recovery of a really cool model of it. Well, Edson does something else, or at least takes credit for something else. It's not entirely clear that he did all of it, but he takes credit for it, which is that now that we have a tracking telescope, which can detect very close range to the eye what the V2 is doing as it's moving in space, it quickly becomes apparent what a mess it is to try to find this thing as it's reaching altitudes of, say, 100 kilometers. What do you do? And the answer is you try to make it stand out as much as humanly possible. So Edson claims credit for producing a design, this zigzag kind of design, as well as the different coloring of the tail, to give some kind of window against the background, especially under non-optimal viewing conditions, for seeing the rocket as it's reaching altitudes that normally couldn't be seen. So the reason I say that it's uncertain is that someone else claims credit for it, namely Clyde Tombaugh. his brother-in-law. So it's not entirely certain who actually devised it. In Edson's scrapbook, he specifically mentions having painted the first one on. That doesn't mean he came up with the idea. So there's a little give and take for who exactly came up with the idea. I think Edson is probably telling the truth that he painted one on himself, but Tombaugh may well have done the same. Love the subtle advertising here on the left, by the way. Buy bonds. But this design, very subtle. But this design becomes kind of iconic. I don't have a picture of the bumper rocket here, but the bumper rocket also uses this design as the main design, and for the same reason. The Redstone series, developed later through the 50s, retains actually this design. You can see it there in the middle of all three of them. And I would dearly love to know who's actually correct about who designed it, if for no other reason than to put it to rest. At Aberdeen, Edson is overseen by a chief physicist named Thomas Hope Johnson. And Johnson is quite interested in cosmic rays and cosmic radiation. American physics is just on the cusp of developing something like particle physics. There had been particle physics done for some decades by then, but now the particle physics are beginning to converge into something like what will become the standard model. You can see here Johnson acting as translator for Werner Heisenberg on a study of cosmic radiation. And I mentioned Johnson because the final track, so to speak, of this convergence in American science happens with the ability to co-opt the testing of a rocket, in this case the V2, for purposes other than just studying the rocket as such. You're going to launch them anyway. You've got about 100. Why don't you put them to use for something other than just studying the rocket? And one of the most appealing, almost immediately, is the study of the upper atmosphere where only these rockets can reach. Nothing like this before had been done except by balloon, and the balloon simply couldn't attain the reach or altitude of a V2. The upper atmospheric research story has been told quite a lot, and it's generally credited with being one of the linchpins for the American production of space science. It's really this convergence of basic research for its own sake with the goals that it contributes to the US military and US government that as one entity are credited with giving birth to American space science. Goes on from about 1945 to the early 1950s. In point of fact, it's actually still going on now, but it's going on now in a somewhat different form, and this older form has been kind of cannibalized into a much broader and more expansive model with better technology. The usual story of this, which I won't go into too much, it's been published quite a lot, is that a consortium of corporate, government, and scientific institutions work together as a single panel to plan and execute research in the V2 studying the upper atmosphere. The usual story focuses on the Naval Research Laboratory as one of the hubs for this because it's both government funded and specifically scientific. And the person sort of focused on as one of the cores is a man named Ernst Krause, who is an optical physicist, he's a physicist studying cosmic rays and interested in instrumentation for the V2, which he contributes to designing. All of that story is true, but there is a component that's missing, namely this continuity between the older forms of science and the newer ones. I have the Carnegie Institution listed among these. The Carnegie Institution was involved in upper atmospheric research, but was not, as far as I know, part of the V2 panel. And that's a very interesting transition in itself because the Carnegie Institution is one of these older philanthropic organizations founded by an extremely wealthy individual. Whereas the US Army, the Naval Research Laboratory, the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins, which incidentally is founded in 1942, there again, Harvard, but also Princeton and the University of Michigan, Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, General Electric, seeing the corporate angle start to get in. All of these are involved in the V2 panel. And it's in part because there is a convergence, as I mentioned earlier, of basic and applied research funding. The tension between them, which does exist in some institutions, ultimately becomes a multi-purpose serving function, in the sense that applied research, say studying the altitude of the V2 in the upper atmosphere, is extremely important if you plan to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. But it's equally important if you want to study cosmic rays. So if you're studying science for its own sake, you have something to do with. If you want to study science for the purpose of ordnance engineering or of advancing American rocketry in any way, you have an occasion to do it. So the two actually, although there are some tensions and jockeying for funding, especially since the Army is the supplier for all of the rockets, really converge. And here you can see something that I really wanted to emphasize and bring on, which is Thomas Hope Johnson's invitation to Edson his invitation to Edson to propose a plan for how to go about actually using these rockets for the testing of, for the study of the upper atmosphere. The reason I mention it is that it's probably the most anomalous part of the story, in that no print source I have seen so far mentions it. No source I have found so far mentions Edson or these very early stages. And I think in part the reason is that the Carnegie Institution wasn't involved in the upper atmospheric panel. So it's not on the radar, so to speak, of institutions that are actually carrying out this research. But it is the institution, in a sense, that gets the ball rolling. And the person who proposes it is James Edson. This is his draft of the V2 upper atmospheric research proposal, composed about October 1st, 1945. And this handwritten copy is actually read out at a meeting of the Carnegie Institution's Department for Terrestrial Magnetism. See the second page there? There's the plan for it. And you see the start date is October 1st, but he's actually thinking of it starting a little later. I would love to track this and compare it to the actual development of the upper atmospheric panels projects to see whether or not it matches, because his plan in a couple of nodes that I have looked at does match quite well. So if this is true, we have a missing chapter, or at least a missing prologue to the V2's upper atmospheric projects, because no one has actually noticed that Edson is the person who first writes a proposal for it. And as far as I know, no one is aware that the Carnegie Institution is the first institution to discuss the possibility of using the V2 in this way. Edson, however, does seem to have been aware of it. He never misses a moment to self-promote. And you can see at the top right of the leftmost image, this meeting was the beginning of the US program for rocket exploration of the upper atmosphere. It's on November 1st, 1941, so about a month after he's written this proposal, and it is the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution. He reads out this proposal, and the proposal is forwarded by a geophysicist, Harry Vestine, to John A. Fleming, the director of the department. And the two of them together began to think that this is probably an outstanding idea for using the V2, because as geophysicists, both of them are aware of the transition I mentioned earlier with John Strong of geophysics as a window into both other planets and, by corollary, the use of other planets to study the geophysical phenomena of the Earth, because they're all part of one physical manifold. You see Ernest Vestine. I think I said Harry Vestine. Harry is his middle name. Ernest Vestine and John A. Fleming. I mentioned Thomas Hope Johnson, the chief of the BRL, and Johnson has his own ideas, which, as you can imagine, since he's interested in cosmic rays, is the use of the V2 to study cosmic rays. So what we start to see is that actually a few figures on the outskirts of the usual history of this project actually play a fairly pivotal role, but one that fades away quite quickly as the V2 panel becomes the arbiter for the project, and these earlier institutions and individuals become less pronounced in the development. Now comes the final chapter, so to speak, in the process, which is the formal, so to speak, inauguration of a big science paradigm in American science. Because as the Carnegie Institution is meeting, there's a movement well underway, and that has been really since World War II, but especially in its last year, to take the scientific framework that has gotten the United States this far into a future framework that's modeled on it. In other words, a structure that is bankrolled and heavily subsidized by the government through government auspices, but also through universities and institutions that normally would have been much more dislocated and fragmented. Vannevar Bush, who has been really the premier arbiter of American science through the entirety of World War II. He heads the Office of Scientific Research and Development and has the ear of the President of the United States. He realizes, along with a strong consensus of scientists and engineers, that this is the future and that there's no going back once this type of infrastructure has been laid into place. As World War II is winding down, so is funding. And Bush, along with this consensus of scientists and engineers, beckons the federal government to realize that this is not going away and that this, in fact, needs to be the framework for American defense and American basic scientific research. Incidentally, Bush had been, prior to this, the president of the Carnegie Institution, the very institution at which this formal policy for upper atmospheric research had been proposed. So now we can see a convergence of not only this big scientific agenda that Vannevar Bush is pushing, but you can also see the swallowing up of smaller institutions into larger ones. And there's the Naval Research Lab, which again is usually the premier institution kind of flagged for this, but in fact is clearly much more complicated. The only thing I'll mention to summarize this is that the Naval Research Laboratory is headed by Commander Harvey Hall, and his name usually does come up quite often in the histories of this early development of upper atmospheric research. But I do want to mention that in this same proposal at the Carnegie Institution, Commander Hall is present and hears every word and thinks that it's an excellent idea. So it's because, in fact, he was present at the Carnegie Institution's presentation that there's now a movement toward a big scientific perspective that can accommodate it. And there are some outliers who are a little less certain, but the publication by James Van Allen in 1948 of a famous paper, The Use of Rockets in Upper Atmospheric Research, is not the first, but really gets the juices flowing by institutions who up to that point had been kind of reserved about doing this kind of work themselves. This is the image of V2 number 20. And it's from a publication by Ernst Krauss, the man I mentioned before. And the main function of the V2 is to remove the warhead from the earlier weaponized V2 and to replace the warhead, the payload, with scientific instruments for the studying of cosmic rays and so on. And there you can see a very nice diagram from the same publication of exactly how this works. The New York Times publishes a very famous image in March of 1947 of a V2 launched from White Sands, which is presented sometimes as being the first photograph taken from that high an altitude of Earth. But in fact, V2 number 13, the previous October, had been launched and showed an image almost as clear and certainly as beautiful. And all of them are published in a very small print run of a V2 photography collection. All this time, Edson's been working on his PhD, and he finally gets it. He's awarded the PhD in 1949, working under John D. Strong at Johns Hopkins, who by now is the director of the Laboratory of Astrophysics and Physical Meteorology. Notice that astrophysics and physical meteorology have in fact started to converge into a fully planetary perspective that treats planets and the Earth as a continuum of one physical phenomenon. He publishes his dissertation as a report of the ballistics research laboratories. Nobody reads it because it's restricted, but it is published, and now it's unrestricted, so anyone can read it. I'll close by just mentioning the near-Earth satellite search, because as Edson's progress advances in the Army Office of Ordnance, he's eventually hired by the Army's, I'm going to get this right, Office of Chief of Ordnance, OCO. And there decides that if the V2 is going to be used for rocketry beyond simply scientific research, that if it's going to move toward an astronautic age, which everyone begins to think is feasible, we need to make sure that interstellar space doesn't have objects that could immediately destroy any rocket launched into them. Now, this also has an applied perspective with or without humans, in the sense that satellites are just about to be launched, and there's a clear awareness that the launching of satellites will require the knowledge of whether or not the skies, so to speak, in interstellar space are clear. It's led by Tombaugh, but it's overseen by Edson through the OCO. And although it's kind of presented as a small or marginal project, it not only sets the stage for satellite launch, it also sets the stage for space exploration and travel. Because now, for the first time, you have an all clear that interstellar space can, in fact, take rockets without destroying them and everyone in them. And there you can see an image of the final report in 1959 sent by Tombaugh to Edson, clarifying that, in fact, they found nothing to indicate that interstellar space will be a problem for rocket launches. 1959, of course, is a year after NASA is founded. So by now, there is a clear movement toward astronautics as a norm, and having clear skies makes that norm actually possible. So we've seen now the convergence of American science toward something like a big scientific perspective. The skies are clear. The US has an enormous cash boost. World War II destroyed a lot of things, but not the American economy. The US has an enormous amount of cash, and incidentally is marching toward global hegemony, while the wealthiest countries prior to World War II are almost all devastated. The US has von Braun and the team and their enormous progress in American rocketry. There's now also international mobility and cooperation. Not everybody, there's not any kumbayaing, but there is now, through aircraft, through communication, an ability to coordinate across different countries and across different continents toward a common agenda that converges on a big scientific model of scientific work. You can think of the National Science Foundation, founded in 1950. You see the National Science Foundation Act there. NASA, founded in 1958, with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which eventually becomes part of NASA. Redstone Arsenal, the enormous proliferation of universities, the human population of Earth doubles, and with it the need for educational institutions. So all of these veins that are formerly part of small institutions and overseen by a handful of philanthropic and wealthy initiatives now is becoming normative as a big scientific institutional project. You see the national labs, which are certainly a World War II holdover and are still with us, Brookhaven, Los Alamos, name it. And what I've called mixed institutions. Some of these older, wealthy institutions that get some government funding, Carnegie, the Applied Physics Lab, same thing, Aberdeen, those sorts of institutions. There's the National Aeronautics and Space Act, 1958, and Kennedy giving his famous speech to put a man on the moon within the decade, which the US does achieve. So Bill Godbey and I in conversations about Edson have talked about him as the invisible man, because while he's involved in all of this and a whole lot more, he's almost never mentioned in any formal histories of them. And I think one of the main reasons is that with big science comes big management. And within that giant sprawling bureaucracy, it's sometimes hard to get a handle on what an individual is actually doing, even when preserving their own documents. Edson doesn't preserve everything, but he does preserve a lot. He does have a storied career from this point on. I won't read out everything he does from then on, but you can see he's involved in the Pentagon, tactical nuclear weapons, a major landmark and shift in American nuclear program, OCO, Project Vanguard, the International Geophysical Year, and so on, including the post office at the bottom. This transformation that Edson's life undergoes, from being part of a small, low-staff institution funded by a philanthropic initiative, to a big scientific bureaucracy in which he has managerial power, but also scientific managerial power with technical expertise, is in a sense a prototype for what most American science begins to look like from the shift to, say, the 1960s. And that model is still very much with us. So with that, I will open up to questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, and anything else that interests you. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
You're capable of answering them quickly, probably. But
I'll try.
The teaser, Cold War progress.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, in this context, what was his definition of progress? What does that mean?
So I won't give you the full version, unless you guys want to stay here another couple hours. But I won't give you the full version, but I will say he was acutely aware of and interested in it. In fact, I think I have a slide of it.
What did he mean by what was progress?
He envisioned history as a history of deadly contests that had been going on from time immemorial and would go on indefinitely. And to him, the Cold War was a kind of inevitable emergence, not necessarily in the exact form that it took, but in the sense that there will be always deadly contests between the major powers. So he's not quite a cutthroat realist, and he's not uninterested in peace or international cooperation, but he does see progress as being contingent on the American ideal of free speech. It's a very Cold War era idea, especially from an American raised in a military context. The only name I'll mention is this man. He's kind of cool, Lewis Fry Richardson. He's a meteorologist. But in 1922, I'm sorry, in 1919, I believe, or 1909, I forget, he began something very new, which is studying international conflict and war using mathematics. He's the first to really do this in a conspicuous way. And it was in part because he was a Quaker and very strongly advocated peace. So if you want to achieve peace, you need to understand war with extreme precision. And I think somewhere early in Edson's education, probably at Caltech, along with this exposure to Strong, he comes into contact with meteorology and at the same time begins to develop an interest in one of the premier mathematical meteorologists' work on peace. And he envisions conflict along these same mathematized lines. I should mention in passing that game theory is also developed during the 40s and 50s. So he's able to advance some of Richardson's ideas in his own mind, but it's always with a certainly un-Quaker and more realistic sense that conflicts will persist and that progress will be contingent on selling the American ideal to the world in a fashion that will make other societies conducive to the U.S. and supportive of the U.S. and hostile to the USSR. In other words, he's a Cold War American from the Army. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you talked about the relationship that Edson has with Tombaugh. They're connected by marriage now, but was there any kind of rivalry in the work they were doing? Did they get along well with each other?
Well, you're in the archives. Go look at his collection. No, I'm just kidding. From everything that I've seen of their correspondence, they got along swimmingly. Sometimes they're in the same place, but not too often. But as far as I can tell, there's no distinct rivalry. In fact, there's a great deal of cooperation, because when Tombaugh is working at White Sands and Edson is overseeing work at White Sands from Aberdeen, the T-series tracking telescopes following T1 that Edson develops are actually developed by Tombaugh. The optical systems for them are developed by Tombaugh in consultation with Edson, and the later tracking telescopes are also products of Tombaugh. So clearly Edson didn't find this to be a problem or stepping on his toes. Everything I've seen indicates that they cooperated. The one thing they seem to have differed on was who actually came up with the design for the V2. It was the V2 zigzag. Yeah.
I'm curious about the name of the missile V2. It seems that it wasn't changed, at least in its notes, until 1950, right?
He
had the same name, V2.
So I think even maybe in his proposal, I have to double check, but I think even in his proposal for using the V2s for scientific research in 1945, he's already referring to it as the V2. He works on the cutting edge of American rocketry, so he's certainly not going to use the German name.
And the German name is used from
the V stands for vengeance. Yeah. There's a great book. There's a great book. Yeah, there's a great book about the development of American space science through the V2 projects. Called Science with a Vengeance. Very clever. And if any of you have seen or read it, you may have noticed I actually stole the color scheme from the cover of that book because it looks so nice and also matches the military's yellow-blue scheme that they still use for some reason.
Have you found any evidence regarding different questions regarding space about the Cold War? Have you found any evidence in the archival materials about his reaction to the Sputnik in 1957?
It did. I don't think he had any inkling of its development prior to that. Eisenhower, for example, did. It was actually known long before it became public that Sputnik was in development and had been for quite a while. But as far as I know, most of his reaction to Sputnik has been in line with what he already knew was going to come. In other words, before Sputnik was developed and launched, he knew that somewhere someone was going to develop a satellite. And when it did, whatever nation did, it was going to become a problem. So he already had a cutting edge rocketeer's kind of knowledge of what this must look like. And he actually is the Army's liaison officer for Project Vanguard, which is the first attempt by the US to produce and launch a satellite. They don't use von Braun's team in Project Vanguard, and without being too monocausal as a historian, I think that maybe they should have, because Vanguard in its initial form doesn't succeed, and I think one of the reasons is in part that they're relying on their own homegrown rocketry without that knowledge. I don't know of anything else apart from Edson's already very clear cooking up of ideas about American progress and the need to overcome the USSR. So this would have been for him one more piece of the puzzle and one more piece of evidence that this is what the West and the US in particular have to do. Does that make sense?
Clyde must have known about it because Whipple was developing a system to track satellites using volunteers around them, and Clyde was involved with that. And surely James Edson would have been involved in it too.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. There's just nothing in his archive to actually explain what it is. But yeah, he almost certainly. I mean, he knew about the transition from strategic atomic weapons to tactical ones probably half a decade before it was even started. And he knew that this would be coming. So yeah, thanks, Jim. That's almost certainly true that he at least had some inkling of a satellite in development and knew that there would be something coming. Anybody else? Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming out.
Well done.